Hi, it's great to be here. What a notable and extraordinary group of people you brought together here. I have to note that you mentioned Gulliver's Travels. I don't know if everybody knows, but part of what Swift was doing in that book was satirizing the Royal Academy, and especially Isaac Newton, who was head of the Royal Academy. Gulliver's Travels was published in 1726. Newton was president of the Royal Academy until 1727. And partly because of Irish politics and Newton's involvement with it, and Jonathan Swift being a member, an Irishman, there was differences of opinion between Newton and Swift. And in Gulliver's Travels, there's a satire about academies of projectors, people who would get together and develop projects for human good, like the Royal Academy, and Swift satirized these projectors in his book. And so that's not the part that we usually think about it. We think of Lilliput. This is the Laputa part of Gulliver's Travels, but it's well worth reading because it's a wonderful satire on the limits of human knowledge and the inabilities of academies of projectors to solve problems, which I think gets back to your main theme, Julia, that we have not yet perfected our projection and we need to do better at it. With that, I want to introduce somebody who actually has made a difference in the world and really had enormous impacts on public policy, and that's Janet Napolitano. She was the 21st governor of Arizona from 2003 to 2009, the third United States Secretary of Homeland Security from 2009 to 2013 under Barack Obama, where she originated, invented the DACA program, which changed the lives of lots of undocumented young people in America for the better. Then she became president of the University of California system. And as president of the University of California system, she found herself in the unusual position of actually suing the Department of Homeland Security because they had changed the DACA program in ways that the University of California thought was unacceptable. So Janet Napolitano is an extraordinary person who's done extraordinary things. She's somebody who has projects that work and that make a difference. She's now the head of a center at the Goldman School, the Center for Security and Politics, and she's trying to figure out how we can actually make sure that in the future, when we have pandemics and other kinds of security threats like that, that we can be prepared for them. That we can be an academy of projectors that actually succeeds in our projects. With that, let me give you Janet Napolitano.
Well, thank you, Henry. And I'm going to have to go back and reread Gulliver's Travels. I haven't read it for decades. And Julia, thank you for assembling this set of discussions today. I'm going to kick us off by discussing some of the public policy issues around pandemic planning. And I approach this as someone who is a lawyer by training. Don't blame me, but I am a lawyer. I'm not a technologist. I'm not a scientist. I actually think one of the problems that we have in terms of pandemic planning and prevention is not enough concrete discussion between the scientific community and the legal and regulatory community that makes up our government at different levels. And that's an issue that confronts us in a lot of different ways, but it's particularly apt when we're talking about pandemic planning and projection. Now, we've known for a long time in the United States that there was going to be a pandemic. We actually, in 2009, had kind of a mini, I'll call it a mini pandemic, because the mortality rate was much lower than COVID-19, but the H1N1 flu. I was Secretary of Homeland Security when that arose. And we didn't have a Secretary of Health and Human Services then. at least at the beginning of the pandemic. And so President Obama asked me to coordinate the federal response to H1N1. Now, the issues in H1N1 were very different than COVID-19. It was a form of flu. The United States was able to quickly identify a candidate for vaccine. The first reported case in the United States was in April of 2009, and a national vaccine campaign had actually begun by that fall. And it turned out that the H1N1 flu particularly impacted young people, not the elderly like we see with COVID-19. But we had kind of a dry run about what worked, what didn't work on H1N1. And then as things go and crises of different types keep happening, there was no real serious, I believe, effort to step back and really analyze what went right, what went wrong on H1N1. And that left us somewhat unprepared for COVID-19. Now, I think as vaccines have become available, the US economy has begun to recover. We need to remind ourselves how we got here in the COVID-19 situation. Just last September, the virus globally had infected 25 million. It had killed 846,000. Those numbers undoubtedly are way too conservative. The United States had suffered the biggest economic collapse since the Great Depression. During its early stages, there was some time lost due to actions or inactions from China with respect to being transparent about what was going on in Wuhan. Some statements by the World Health Organization didn't help. So we lost some valuable time at the outset. But once COVID-19 went global, the national performances greatly diverged. And I think the single most important determinant in terms of how countries did in the early response to COVID-19 was the quality of political leadership and execution. The US has 4% of the world's population, but in 2020, it accounted for 1/4 of all known cases and more than 20% of deaths globally from COVID-19. And as I mentioned, it suffered its greatest economic collapse since the Great Depression. In fact, the GDP of the United States fell 9.5% in the second quarter of 2020, the largest quarterly decline in US history. What went wrong? Why the flawed response from the United States? First, the federal government did not mobilize a national response. It left it to the states. And that was problematic because different states had different incidents of disease and had different levels of preparation. There was no consistent federal science-based message. There was no coherent communications plan with the public about what we knew, what we didn't know, how people could act to protect themselves, their families, and their communities. And politics came into play. Who would have thought that wearing a mask would become itself a political statement? There was a real fault in having any kind of scalable national system for testing of the sort that would have made a difference. And there was no national plan in place for contact tracing. So of course, when you're dealing with a pandemic, testing and tracing are the earliest tactics you have available to identify where disease is breaking out and to isolate communities where it is happening, so that there's a way to contain the disease before it spreads more rapidly. I think there are many lessons learned, and I'm going to give an initial overview of some of those lessons and then dive in a little bit deeper. But I believe the United States should make pandemic preparedness a national security priority on par with national defense. We put inordinate resources into our military. We have the best military in the world. We call on them actually when we need help, and for good reason. But they get the sort of priority in terms of policy making in Washington, D.C. that pandemic preparedness really needs to have. We need to reform the CDC. We need to go back and analyze what happened early in this pandemic. Why did we have such a failure of testing and test approvals and all the other kinds of initial delays that Julia mentioned in her opening remarks? We need to clarify federal and state authorities and their roles in pandemic response. When you're talking about a true pandemic, it is a national security issue. But a lot of the things that need to be done from a public health standpoint happen at the state level. And the implementation and execution happens at the state level, and indeed happens at the sub-state level in county public health departments, for example. The example that Julia gave of the cotton swabs in California is a great example of how complicated things get when they get devolved to the states, and there's no consistent federal overlay. We need to clarify that. We need to fix that. We need a nationwide strategy for testing and contact tracing. We need to enhance the resilience of our medical supply chains. This was something we ran into in H1N1, where we discovered, much to our dismay, that there was really no vaccine production capability retained within the United States. That is one of the changes that happened in post H1N1, is to bring vaccine manufacture back to the United States to some degree. But medical supply chains are inordinately complicated. And it turned out that for many of the supplies we needed, they were originated in China, and China was not exporting anymore. So really looking at the medical supply chain phenomenon needs to occur. We need to study why there is resistance by some in our population to taking a vaccine, and how can we lower that level of resistance so that once vaccines are on board and they're safe and effective, we get greater uptake by the population. This is work that should be done by social scientists as well as those in the hard sciences. But this is a key factor that we are now confronting in the United States. And we need to support research and development, not only into different types of testing methodologies, but also into not only vaccine development, but the development of therapeutics for those who do become ill. So those are a few that's a quick overview of where we should focus some of our attention. But I think it important to say that the national and international dimensions of a pandemic are mutually reinforcing and cannot be considered in isolation. This is a global pandemic, and the United States, as a global leader, should lead. We need the creation of a true global framework to ensure the equitable allocation of vaccine. We need to create a flexible international coalition to help mobilize the economic, security, and private sector response when there is a pandemic. We need to establish a global epidemic surveillance and forecasting capacity to make us less dependent on the transparency of earlier infected countries and the risk assessments by the WHO emergency community. We need to partner with other nations and international finance institutions to assist lower income countries. And we need to consider backing an autonomous, I will call it a watchdog group, to report on compliance with the international health regulations. IHRs are the international legal foundation for global health security. And greater compliance with IHRs would counter the weakness we experience in the UN system, which is too often unwilling to challenge powerful member countries. In this connection, I think it important for the scientific community to better understand the politics of policymaking for pandemic preparedness and response. For example, for COVID, the tensions between the United States and China frustrated international and multilateral cooperation at the G20, G7, and the UN Security Council. There was a breakdown in compliance with international health regulations, the IHR, which, as I mentioned, is the main international legal agreement governing dangerous disease events. The WHO was hesitant to declare a public health emergency of international concern for fear of alienating China. The scientific community has a key role to play here to rally to strengthen the WHO and to help create another more agile international coalition to enforce compliance with global standards. And the scientific community needs to better understand what happened in the US domestically, what went wrong and what went right. And that, of course, is one of the purposes of today's important conference. So I've already mentioned a little bit about what went wrong, but let me recap. Despite intelligence and public health warnings about the coming pandemic, about a new type of flu that was appearing in Wuhan, there was no organizational effort to confront the pandemic as a national security threat. And that meant, in part, that there was no focal point at the White House. There was no senior advisor to the President of the United States who was responsible for coordinating all of the federal response and public communications that needed to occur. The failures in having a national testing and tracing capacity led to blunt interventions at the state and local level. Without clear federal guidance, states had no option really but to enforce shutdown orders. And we all can recall a year ago in the Bay Area, you could cross the Bay Bridge and maybe not even see another car. It was a real shutdown. But also without clear federal guidance, many states relaxed their shutdowns and their guidelines prematurely. The pandemic also exposed inadequate investment in state and local health systems. What do I mean by that? Public health in the United States is generally managed at the local level in public health departments. I was on a phone call just last evening with former Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, and we were talking about this issue. And she reminded me that as a result of the recession in the United States in 2009 and 2010, the number of employees in our local public health departments across the United States was reduced by around 25%. And those numbers, those personnel have not been replaced. And so we saw the cracks in our systems really become not just cracks, but crevices. And of course, there was such opposition by some members of the public and anger that they took out on their local public health officials. And so many have simply retired or left the field even during this last year because they were left to shoulder the blame. And they were, of course, not blameworthy. Another thing that went wrong was the failure to maintain an adequate strategic national stockpile and to have clear rules governing its use. And that led to shortages of essential medical supplies and competition amongst states for scarce medical equipment and personal protective equipment. The SNS, the Strategic National Stockpile, is managed through the Department of Homeland Security, but it had failed to get congressional budget authority. It had failed to keep its supplies that were in the stockpile updated so that they were usable. And a decision had been made in the Trump administration that they were going to focus the stockpile on countering anthrax attacks, not countering pandemics. You can always go back and second guess a strategic decision of that sort, but I think the real question is, why couldn't we do both? And as I've mentioned, there was great confusion about the respective roles of federal, state, local, and tribal governments. Who owned what responsibilities during this pandemic? Now, what went right? Some things did go right. The accelerated development of vaccines and therapeutics. This was a triumph of science. A year ago, it was predicted that we wouldn't have a vaccine even in clinical trials much before the second half of 2021. And of course, through decisions made, through the creation, and I'll give the Trump administration credit here, of Operation Warp Speed, they were able to greatly accelerate the development and manufacture of vaccine. And then they made some very good decisions about early purchases of vaccine, early and massive purchases of vaccine, so that vaccine manufacturers, the pharmaceutical companies, could proceed and set up their plants and get the relevant equipment, all of that goes into vaccine manufacture. They could make those investments without fear of financial risk. The US government took the risk out of that process. And that also greatly accelerated not just the vaccine development and trials, but then also the manufacture. Antibody therapies for the seriously ill or hospitalized patients came into play, and there are more in the works. And those therapies may indeed have other uses for other diseases besides COVID. And the aggressive use of emergency use authorizations by the FDA sped the deployment of the vaccine. Emergency use authorization, you need to be careful here. Vaccines are going to be injected into a human body. They need to be safe. They need to be effective. But in the evaluation of risk, I think the federal government appropriately determined that they had enough basis for the safety and efficacy evaluation of the vaccines that they could proceed without the complete approval process that we normally require. The pandemic, however, it's not over. In the United States, vaccine resistance will undercut herd immunity. And I've already mentioned the need to really study what causes somebody to be resistant to taking a vaccine and what can be done to counter that. We're seeing the emergence of new variants of various levels of lethality. We still don't really understand all of the impacts of COVID-19. The long haulers, for example, what causes somebody to be a long hauler where COVID is concerned? And we also, I think, need to understand that for COVID, we're probably going to be in a world where it won't be eradicated, but it can be reduced to tolerable levels with occasional spikes of activity, and that there will need to be a continuous vaccine program, sort of like we do for the flu. Congress has an important role to play here. And I haven't mentioned Congress yet because when you come from the executive branch, as I did, Congress is a different world altogether. But those in the scientific community really need to understand how complicated Congress is and how important a role it plays in our United States system. As I mentioned, Congress needs to treat pandemics as a national security threat. Think about how COVID-19 brought this country to its knees for a while. And there was great concern about our ability to recover. Now it turns out, particularly because of the strength of our scientific community and our advances there, we are recovering. But it was and is a true security threat. Congress needs to appropriate funds for a comprehensive health security budget, including funds for global and domestic epidemiological threat surveillance and assessment, including funds for pandemic preparedness at the state and local level, and also with state and local hospitals. It needs to appropriate funds for the strategic national stockpile. It needs to appropriate funds to provide assistance for other vulnerable countries. And Congress should exempt critical budget line items from any future budget caps and sequesters. What does that mean? What it means in budget language is that there needs to be a comprehensive health security budget that is protected from all of the other manipulations that go on in the congressional budget process. Congress should appoint an independent commission to review the CDC's record during the initial months of the pandemic. What went wrong there? And then it needs to be fixed. Congress should establish and enforce pandemic readiness standards for hospitals and health systems. And they need to make it a practice as part of those standards to collect and share data on specific populations, i.e. Blacks, Native Americans, Latinx, low income, and the elderly. And they need to target public health investments to increase resilience in those communities that have been particularly hard hit by COVID. As I've mentioned several times, Congress needs to develop and fund a coherent national strategy for testing and tracing that can be rapidly scaled. And the scaling, of course, is so very important. Congress should continue to fund research and development of not only diagnostics, but also therapeutics and also vaccines. And in addition to funding the strategic national stockpile and clarifying its role, Congress should ensure that the stockpile system is prepared to act as a central purchasing agent. One of the problems we've had in COVID was that states were forced to compete against each other for personal protective equipment and other medical supplies. That drove up the price. And there were indeed situations where states or hospitals were able to identify sources of supply from other countries, and then they would be stopped at customs, and they would be seized by customs to go into the federal stockpile. That should never happen, and that needs to be corrected. And that means that Congress should identify issues in the global supply chain and rectify them before the next pandemic. I think that the strength of the United States should be found in a unity of effort between those in the scientific community and those in public policy making and political leadership to demystify and depoliticize the role of science. This is so very important, and I actually think it's one of the causal factors underlying vaccine resistance in our country today. People need to know better how to interpret data. What is reliable data? People need to understand better how to evaluate risk. People need to appreciate the importance of standard public health measures, all of which help protect them, help protect their families, help protect their communities in the incidence of a pandemic. I think when all is said and done, the United States actually lost hundreds of thousands of lives it needn't have lost had we been better prepared. But the work of scientists, both here and around the globe, doubtless saved hundreds of thousands of lives at the same time. We need to focus on the good and mitigate the bad where pandemic is concerned. We can and we must do better, and all of us have a role to play. Julia, that is a quick summary of some of my thoughts with respect to pandemic preparedness.
Thank you so much, Janet. Wonderful talk and very thought-provoking, and really broadened my horizon. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce some questions from the chat. So one is from former CEND employee Kim. Hi. She would be interested to hear what agency should be responsible for coordinating federal pandemic preparedness, in your opinion.
Well, I think if we actually view pandemic as a security issue, and given that it crosses so many elements of the United States science and health, but also education and commerce and trade and diplomacy. I think that's one of the roles the Department of Homeland Security was designed to be prepared to lead. That's why the Department of Homeland Security was asked to help coordinate the federal response to H1N1 back in 2009. It should either be DHS or HHS. But the key thing is that the White House needs to occupy a key role, and there needs to be someone in the White House who is a direct report to the president, who is empowered to work with the cabinet secretaries, the sub-agencies and directors to really help coordinate a federal response. So it needs to be a combination of either DHS and HHS at the agency level, but then really having a point person in the White House.
Thank you. And another question about the role of the military. Could the U.S. military have a stronger role in easing logistical challenges early on, sourcing supplies, running test sites, building and staffing new COVID wards?
Yes. As I mentioned, we have the strongest military in the world. They are often called on to help with emergency response. To help and assist FEMA, for example, when there's a major hurricane. They have the manpower, they have the ability to quickly move supplies to locales where they're needed. They really have mastered the whole procurement supply chain logistical morass that we confront. And so either they play a greater role, or indeed we use them to help train the civilian workforce better how to manage massive logistical challenges such as occur during a pandemic.
All right, thank you. And then how can countries and member states go about revisiting IHR and potentially revising regulations to help better respond to pandemics?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I suggested that the United States should help lead a coalition of other countries that would be more agile than the WHO and certainly the UN. Such a coalition could take on as one of its initial tasks revisiting the IHRs, making sure they are updated, and developing a whole compliance methodology, a set of compliance standards, a set of surveillance requirements, and the like, that are done continuously so that they just become part of the pattern of how public health is governed around the globe. Now, of course, it's a terribly difficult time to accomplish that, because so many countries of the world are really in the throes of COVID. The incidents in India, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, a second example. The focus now needs to be on putting out that fire in those countries. But as those fires are extinguished, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, how can the international community of nations be better organized and prepared to not only prevent pandemic, but respond more effectively?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your insights. It's been wonderful to hear from you, and I'm very glad actually to see you taking an active role in this disaster preparedness pandemic response here in Berkeley, because I mean, people, that's the people we need to move the needle. So thank you so much, Janet, for your time. Really appreciate it.